Ladies and gentlemen, GCU-ACM student chapter extends a warm welcome to all of you on this ACM distinguished talk titled Scientific Paper Writing. Now, let me give you a short introduction of what this talk is going to be about. This talk will revolve around how the act of paper writing works, what the top lessons learned are, and the difference between scientific paper writing and journalism. How you can become the sculptor and designer of your thoughts and ideas for your research paper. The top 10 most important do's and don'ts for thinking and writing scientific papers, the purpose of writing papers, as well as the two fundamental ways to approach knowledge will be focused on in this talk. Secondly, this talk will discuss the art and science of writing an outstanding abstract. The lecture will explain the do's and don'ts for this topic as well as teach you the 10 most important things you need to remember when you write a paper. Thirdly, the fundamentals of writing with co-authors will be also highlighted. Which tools should one use? What are the do's and don'ts for collaborating with co-authors to remember? Which author's name should go first? Which should go last? What is the mystery behind author list? What is the concept of peer reviewing, which stands at the heart of scientific process, will also be discussed in this talk in detail. Who are peers who evaluate your paper? How is the overall process from submitting your paper to its publication? What are the most important steps in all this process? Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce our ACM distinguished speaker for this talk, Dr. Schahram Dustdar. Dr. Dustdar is a full professor of computer science, heading the research division of distributed systems at the Technical University of Vienna in Austria. He holds several honorary positions in University of California, Los Angeles, Monash University in Melbourne, Shanghai University, Macquarie University in Sydney, and University of Groningen, Netherlands. From December 2016 until January 2017, he was a visiting professor at the University of Sevilla, Spain. And from January until June 2017, he was a visiting professor at UC Berkeley in USA. From 1999 to 2007, he worked as the co-founder and chief scientist of Caramba Labs Software AG in Vienna, which was later acquired by Project Network AG. This is a company which was a venture capital co-funded software company focused in software for collaborative processes in teams. Caramba Labs was later nominated for several international and national awards, including World Technology Award in the category of software in 2001, Top Startup Companies in Austria in 2002, Mercer Innovation Award for the Austrian Chamber of Commerce in 2002. Dr. Dustdar is the founding co-editor-in-chief of the new ACM Transactions on Internet of Things, as well as editor-in-chief of Computer, Springer. He is an associate editor of IEEE Transactions on Services Computing, IEEE Transactions on Cloud Computing, ACM Transactions on the Web, and ACM Transactions on Internet Technology, as well as on the editorial board of IEEE Internet Computing and IEEE Computer. Dr. Dustdar is recipient of ACM Distinguished Scientific Award in Scientist Award in 2009, the IBM Faculty Award in 2012. He's also an elected member of Academia Europa, which is the Academy of Europe, where he's the chairman for the informatics section, as well as an IEEE fellow since 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, with huge honor, let me please welcome Dr. Schahram Dustdar.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Is my audio okay? Is it working?
Yes, doctor, it's working fine.
Okay, so I will share my slides. I hope you can see them now. Can you please confirm?
Yes, doctor, they're working fine.
Okay, wonderful. So let me check. Anyway, I don't see anyone here, but it's all right. I hope it works. So this talk is, as was mentioned in the introduction, on scientific paper writing. And in particular, the highlights were discussed briefly, introduced briefly. So let me begin by addressing what scientific paper writing and thinking is all about. As you see in this headline already, it is not just writing, it's actually both sides of one coin. So writing and thinking are two processes which help each other. And the idea really is to understand that writing and thinking help you to develop your ideas further. So it's not only that you look at things in a sequential mode, first you think and then you write, but actually when you write, you discover what you have thought, and maybe you're not very happy with that. Usually that's what is happening, right? You want to improve it. So now I'm assuming that basically the audience is from undergraduate students, maybe then to graduate students, etc. So basically I want to ground all of this into the beginnings of what you have learned at school or in high school. So there you learned that writing is about repeating what was said before or thought before by your teacher. But I would like you to challenge this thought. It's not about what you have learned at school, about the purpose of writing. It is different. Scientific paper writing is also not like journalism. You are not reporting person A said this, person B said this, and just uttering facts, so to speak. So it is different as well in this respect. You basically use writing to help yourself thinking as well. So this is an important aspect to it all. So writing helps you to think clearly. What are your thoughts? It helps you to organize your thoughts. The readers look at your text to understand your world and not the world as it is. So it's not an objective world, even though that science and the whole process of science is claiming to be objective. Nevertheless, the paper itself, the artifact that you are creating, is really your world. It's an abstraction of your thinking, so to speak, and thereby the abstraction of your world. And the reader wants or does not want to understand your world. Actually, the readers don't care about you personally. So this is another difference to the teacher at school. So the teacher at school, in high school, they read your paper and they are interested in your progress, right? Typically, in the best case, let's say. But in science, they read your paper because they hope that your paper, your text is actually of value to them. So in other words, this is the famous contribution that you deliver. So what is the value to the reader by spending time and energy reading your paper? This is very important for you to understand, because otherwise you will not succeed. So the value is not only in the knowledge, as important as it may be, but it is more. The scientific model that you present in your paper actually beats that simple knowledge. It trumps it, right? So it is more important than simply the iteration of facts. So the model is an abstraction of how you make sense with this. And this is the important part. This is the actual contribution. So it is important to understand that you don't simply explain what's inside your head, but actually create a model by which you relate the things that you have learned and understood on a deeper level to the outside world. Now, an important fact that you have to always consider is that academic readers have a professional function, and that is to challenge you. So the idea of academics, as we are trained, is when we read a paper, we constantly go into challenge that idea that we are reading. And this is basically a feature or a bug, depending on how you see it, but you need to be aware of it. So initially, when you begin your studies, you are not like that. Typically, because when you come from school, you learn to accept what people tell you is a fact. However, once you go through the steps in academia, you learn to challenge, and you do that constantly. So you read a paper and you constantly update your model and you challenge what you are reading. Now, this is very important which we will discuss also in the later parts of this presentation when it comes to the peer reviewing process. So what is the purpose of writing the paper? So the purpose of this scientific paper is to change the reader's view on the value of what you are giving, right? So basically, first, the reader thinks the topic is maybe not so interesting. After reading your paper, he or she discovers this is actually super interesting. Did not appreciate the value before, appreciates the value after reading your paper. Each scientific community has a particular code of values, a list of words, some doubts, some beliefs, some preferred methods that they use. Now, you are typically, I guess, in computer science, but even inside computer science, there are different communities. Computer, let's say, graphics is different than computational logic, is different to distributed systems, is different to software engineering, is different to business informatics, etc. So all of these different communities have different code of values, they have different words, they have different methods. In some cases, qualitative interviews may be the right method to choose. In other more engineering dominated communities, it might be not an option at all. You have to do performance measurements, etc. So in other words, you have to pick the right code of values, the right list of words, etc. You have to speak to the doubts, to the beliefs, and to the methods inside that community. Of course, in order to do that, you need to be able to understand what they are in the first place, right? So you have to know and make yourself familiar with those doubts, those list of words and values. So you have a lot of homework to do by simply reading the papers that are typically published in that community and reason about them. You have to predict, in a sense, also what the reader doubts. So in other words, you have to know what are the current beliefs in order to know what they doubt, right? So it's like playing chess, in a sense, against yourself. You do a move and you also have to think about what the other side is basically thinking about your move and deciding his own move. This is also important when we talk about the later part in the peer review. This is important not only because you want to get your paper accepted, this also strengthens your way, how you sharpen your arguments by writing your arguments, your paper, your storyline. So the function of scientific paper writing is therefore to move a subject forward and not to preserve the status quo. So in other words, it is important to add value. So to put it very frankly, there is no value in you writing a paper saying everything that has been written before on that particular topic is right, okay? Because it has been said before, so your question is, what is different? Why is your paper, why is your contribution unique and different to the others? This is a very crucial point. And this brings me to the topic of bounded versus unbounded knowledge. So the storyline basically is typically for a very good scientific paper, you have to create tension. You have to present a challenge, some form of instability that you are addressing in your paper. Because if everything is super perfectly fine, there is no reason for you to write the paper. So where is the tension? In other words, where is the problem? Where is the challenge? What are the issues? Why is it not good enough to stay where we are? So in this case, it is very important that you do not have a bounded model of knowledge, right? The bounded model of knowledge is basically saying that you identify gaps and try to fill them with your paper. So it says knowledge is bounded. It has basically a lower bound and it has an upper bound, and you are just filling in the gaps. And this is usually not a very good paper. You have to use language of costs and benefits. So in other words, you have to be more precise in terms of what are the costs if you take your approach, if the reader invests in your approach, versus the benefits that he or she will gain when he uses your approach in your paper. Secondly, we have to deal with functional writing. So this means that you have to define whose problem you are addressing. Again, coming back to the ideas of the community, of the code that the people use in that community. It is not an obvious thing, right? So for example, let's say in distributed systems, the field that I am, the question is, who are you, so whose problem are you helping to solve? Is it the problem of the software engineer? Is it the problem of the infrastructure provider? Is it the problem of the business model owner, or what have you, right? So there are different ways to look at a problem, to frame a certain problem. You have to be very clear about that. And that is actually not so easy in many cases, because you have to dig out what is in your intuition and then bring that to paper. Thirdly, you have to build a story. You have to model a line of argumentation. So this is a very important aspect to this. And this is going back to the first aspect, to create attention, to present a challenge, and to present some form of instability. So the story goes back to the very notion of telling a mythical story. In methodology, there is always a challenge for the hero. The hero goes through different stages of dealing with that challenge, has fights, overcomes them, and then goes back and reports the challenges and how he or she solved those challenges. And there is a clear story behind all of this. And you have to be aware of what the story is. If you are not aware of that story, you cannot tell the story, right? There is always a story. And you will remember that when you read great papers, you will discover that there is always a story behind it. So the structure of scientific papers is following that, what I was just saying. So in a mythical story, the stages that I was describing to you before are pretty much always the same. They are always the same in Hollywood movies, in Bollywood movies, in what have you. They're always the same pattern. And similarly, in scientific papers, we also have a well-defined structure. And the structure is listed here. And what I would like to propose to you is not to mess with the structure. Similarly, when you see a movie, when the structure is not following what I was just telling you, it is really an uncomfortable movie. And similarly, it is happening with scientific papers. So the scientific paper has essentially these 10 steps. Presents the abstracts, shows some keywords, presents an introduction to the topic, presents a motivation by these problems that you're addressing is of relevance. So in other words, creates the tension. So the introduction and the motivation create the tension. Then related work and state of the art present the abstraction of the model, basically tells the reader what happened so far. Going back to the movie analogy, it is basically that you see the context where, from which place the hero is coming from. Number 6 is really the core of your paper, the contribution and its limits. Similarly to the model of the movie, the hero is trying his best, her best to reach a certain result, constantly hits the limits, and then finally succeeds. And this is basically the notion of number 6 and 7. Here you present your contribution. Where does it contribute to progress in science, and where are the limitations? And also you show the evaluation, how you prove that it actually is true what you're saying. And this evaluation is actually dependent on the context. of your community, it goes back to the question of what are the methods, the scientific methods that you're using. In number 8, you typically present future work, because it is important to understand that science is never finished. It may sound like it is finished. Nowadays, people think, okay, here is science, that's it, end of story. However, the reality is that in the 300 years of science, we have seen that what has been proven, under quotes, correct 50 years ago, its exact opposite is proven now. And similarly, it will continue to do so, because we dig deeper into the reality, the different layers of reality, and we begin to understand what is actually closer to the truth, so to speak. Maybe there is no truth. Maybe we just discover more and more layers and discover more fine-grained realities as they are. So what I'm saying is that there will always remain a number of items that are open to future research. And that is basically the chapter of, or the section of, future work. In this section, you basically describe what is open there to do, because obviously in your paper, you could not deal with everything. That's quite an important section of your paper, because here you basically present the ground of other researchers to join your research endeavor. You say, these are the open questions. These things I could not handle in this paper. They were actually out of scope, as we say. So this is open to future work, to future research. And dear colleagues, everybody is invited to contribute to this. Finally, you present your conclusion. The conclusion is extremely important, similar to the abstract. Why? Because the conclusion is actually the thing that the reader definitely will read. He wants to understand what is your contribution and what is the bottom line of your argument. Is it bringing any value or not? So abstract and conclusion, the beginning and the end, are really important, right? So you have to pay attention to those. Of course, you can only write both of them once you have all the rest of it ready. Keep that in mind. Finally, number 10, the references of the paper. References are essential, because science has this fundamental idea that you build on the work of others, so you are not alone. So why is that important? It is important because if you don't provide the necessary references, the reader will understand that you are not really contributing to that topic. In other words, if you leave out, if you miss, and you show your ignorance that you are not aware of certain references, you will not succeed in your paper getting published. This is very, very important. What is an abstract in the first place? The abstract is a brief explanation of the whole paper, of your larger work. So as you know, reading a research paper is typically a time-consuming task, and the reader or the reviewer makes a decision to read or not to read your paper. Please respect that by providing a very good abstract. So the abstract needs to be engaging. It needs to be truthful. It needs to present the claims that you are doing and crisp, quite frankly. It has to be really to the point. An abstract, the art and science of writing an abstract, is important because an abstract is actually required for virtually all types of papers, be it journal papers, if you write a research grant, if you are further in academia, if you write a book proposal, if you write a PhD thesis, a conference paper, a book chapter, even if you are in business and you don't write academic papers, if you write a white paper for your software company, for example, that typically has an executive summary. That's exactly what an abstract is. So you have to be able to distill everything that you have said in the 20 pages, in the 10 pages, or whatever the pages are, into one abstract. That is an art and that is a science, both at the same time. So why should we write an abstract? Well, there are two main reasons. One is that it provides the reader with the decision making to read it or not to read the paper. Secondly, it is serving a purpose of indexing. So it is used to index the paper in different digital libraries, like IEEE, in ACM, in different journal databases, and also in Google, right? So you have to be very clear about what are the keywords that you are using. And those keywords need to be correct, of course, and not just invent nice keywords because they are buzzwords, right? So in other words, if your paper is not about blockchain and there might be some application area in blockchain and you just put blockchain as a keyword simply to create more buzz around it, it's a bad idea. So it should reflect what the paper is actually about. So coming to the first point, deciding to read your paper. So basically the reader has to decide, is reading that research paper actually worthwhile? This sounds very arrogant. And the problem is that in academia, we always are reading some papers, right? So there is always a stack of papers that we are currently reading. So you have to make priorities, right? So it's a time-consuming task. And the easiest way to judge if it is worthwhile to read a paper, depending on the topic and the purpose of the paper, can take several hours, up to days. You have to decide, and that decision is basically mostly done based on the abstract or maybe the conclusion or the summary, and that is important to keep that in mind. Indexing, as I said before, for all the different purposes of the journals. Now, there are 10 important things I want you to always remember for writing your abstract. You have to first identify your audience, as I have said before. Same like you write your paper, especially for the abstract, also speak in the right language, right? So you have to know who is the audience. If you're writing a paper for a beginner in a particular research community, it looks completely different than if you have a different audience. Write the abstract from scratch. So this means that you should not copy paste all the different points that you think are in the paper and just move them to the abstract. Write them from scratch, condense it in a very special way, fitting its own story in the abstract. The most important information should be written first. So in other words, there is kind of a hierarchy in the abstract. You basically try to create a story which is so engaging that you should write the most important things first, because those are the things that the reader will encounter first. You should use understandable, short, and precise language. Don't write in a very long sentences, which are hard to parse. Life is short, people don't have time. Respect that people are reading your papers in all sorts of difficult circumstances. Some people have to read papers on trains, on planes, in different situations which are kind of stressful. So be precise. The content of your abstract should be written in the same order of the research paper itself. So in other words, the abstract is kind of a fractal to the paper itself. One thing that you can do is basically you can write a sentence from each chapter, each section of your paper, like introduction, motivation, contribution, limits of your work, evaluation, etc., and kind of try to distill each of your sections in the paper into one sentence, but write them from scratch. And then take those sentences and move them into, write them into the abstract. By this, you have ensured that you don't forget anything and you have a complete story, a fractal story of your overall paper. The keywords and phrases that you use should be selected intelligently, as I said before, because this is how people will find your papers in databases. Some trivia: you should check the maximum and minimum count of words in an abstract. So you should not use a too long abstract or too short abstract. You should always follow the guidelines of the journal or the conference, publisher, or what have you. Always, always, always. Always check formatting requirements as well. You would be amazed how many mistakes people make. They submit papers to journals or to conferences by completely ignoring the formatting guidelines. As an editor-in-chief, I can tell you this is not just a unimportant thing. It is important, and I can tell you why it is important. For example, in a conference or in a journal, you have space limitations. For example, you say for a conference 10 pages or 12 pages, or in a journal you say 25 pages are the page limits of your submission. Now, page limits don't make sense if you don't tell anything about the formatting rules, right? So if you have formatting rules which are not obeyed, the submission can be any size, and you are not able to actually know exactly what's the actual page number. The page, is it complying to the page limitations of your journal or of the conference or not? And in most cases, to be honest, that paper, if it does not follow the formatting guidelines, will be desk rejected. So this means that people don't care about the content at all. They look at the paper, it's not in the right format, desk reject. Sorry to inform you, your paper does not meet the requirements. And that is quite a pity. It should not happen to you, right? Because you want your paper to be read and be published. So don't make that mistake. So always follow the formatting guidelines. Also, always check for typos, grammatical and linguistic mistakes. You would be amazed how many papers I receive where there is already mistake in the actual title of the paper. That's extremely annoying and already primes the reader by having negative prejudice towards you, the author of the paper. Because if you already make a mistake in the title, the probability the reader thinks is pretty high that the rest of the paper is full of errors as well. So don't make that mistake. So here's some things which you should not write in the abstract. So first, it should be no copy paste of the context of the content that we have said before. Secondly, no references. Okay, so that's very important. There are exceptions though. If your paper is all about showing that Darwin's evolution is not correct, obviously you want to highlight that in the abstract, right? You said, I'm showing in this paper that Darwin's evolution is not correct. But other than that, don't use references in your abstract. No details in the sense that, some measurements are not really relevant. However, if you are dealing with an engineering style paper saying that your approach is 15% faster than what is currently the state of the art, that you can put in the abstract. But that's not a detail. That's actually on a high level of abstraction quite important. Also, no definitions, even if that is quite important, but the definition can be read in the introduction. Question is when to write the abstract. So some people think, okay, especially undergraduate students, they think, okay, now I'm going to write this paper. I begin with the abstract because this is how it works sequentially. That's a fundamental mistake. So writing the abstract is something that you do at the end of the paper, once the research paper is actually completed and not at the beginning. Why? Because simply you know everything that has happened. So please don't confuse writing the paper abstract with identifying the story or the content of your paper. These are two different things. They are related, but they are not the same. So the abstract itself is an art in itself. The story can be something for you to elaborate. Sometimes you think there is a special story to your paper in a particular way, and halfway through the paper, well, while you're actually doing the research, you discover actually the contribution should be framed in a different way than I had originally thought. That's also good. That's okay. Don't worry. Because after all, everything is a matter of viewpoints. So it's a matter of perspective, right? Remember the example I was giving before about are you writing from the perspective of the developer, of the engineer, of the infrastructure provider, etc. All of these different viewpoints lead to partially complementary conclusions as well. And this is also true for the abstract. What to do after writing the abstract? Well, basically this means that you have completed your paper, right? So then you have to review and revise it yourself. You have to be critical. You should ask colleagues or your professor to review the abstract, get their feedback, and revise again. One fundamental mistake many students make is that they think that once they write the paper, it is finished. It's like a dictation from God. Nothing can be changed. However, good papers are written in number of iterations. So please don't expect from yourself that you write a paper and you get it right the first time, everything is correct. So you write the paper, that's important, get it out there, try to persist it into the written form, and then start to iterate over it. Iteration means that you basically change the content of the paper over and over again. You might move things there, compress sentences, make 2 sentences out of a long sentence, etc., etc. And then finally, also check again whether the abstract actually meets the targeted publisher's requirement again. And also, is it truthful to the actual content of your paper? So the 2 styles of abstract are there. There is an informative style of an abstract, 200 to 250 words, summarizes every aspect of the study, including the results, recommendations, and conclusions. It summarizes the purpose, the methods, the scope, the results. That is commonly used in journals and conferences, in particular in technical research. Then there is the descriptive style of abstracts. So it's shorter. It explains the purpose, objective, methods of the paper, but it doesn't explain the results and conclusion. So the descriptive abstracts are more appropriate for short papers. It makes no judgment about the work, and it does include keywords found in the text as well. And of course, you also see hybrid versions of these 2. So the recap to remember for you, these 10 points: identify your audience, write the abstract from scratch. The most important things should be written first. Use an understandable, short, and effective language. The content of abstract should be written in the same order of the research paper. Don't mess with the structure of your research paper, never, ever. The keywords or the phrases that you should be selected intelligently, that can easily search your research paper in online databases. Check the maximum and minimum counts of words in your abstract. Follow the guidelines of the journal or conference. Check the formatting and check for typos, grammar, and linguistic mistakes. Okay? These are the 10 important things for writing the abstract. Now, the part of scientific paper writing in teams. Virtually all papers that you will write in your career are not written by you alone. This is simply due to the fact that science is a complex endeavor. It's not something for a John Wayne character doing everything on his own. So there are different communities out there in different scientific disciplines. Some communities are known to be having 10, 20, 30, or even more authors. So for example, if you look in papers in physics, they have many, many authors. There are papers from CERN, for example, where you have, 50 papers or 50 authors or more. Typically in computer science, there are maybe 3 authors to maybe 6, 7 authors. That's pretty much the maximum. Because of course, the value, so to speak, of the paper goes down for the individual author if there are many, many authors, right? So that's also a thing that you need to decide. But the number of authors really reflects the complexity of the topic that you're dealing with as well. So if you write in teams, there are a number of things that you should check as well. So how do you write? So it comes down to the tools that you actually use. So check for any constraints, should they exist. So which author types are allowed? So there are some journals which explicitly say we don't want to have student papers submitted. So if you're an undergraduate or graduate student in a very early on, so basically check that with the journal. These things do exist. So deadlines, page limits, templates that you have to use, etc. Then discuss or think about if there is a single versus a group of writer, right? The writing process, how do you organize that? Do you organize that different sections of authors, then they write different sections, or do you do iterations? How do you manage those iterations? Which tools do you use? Do you use Overleaf for LaTeX on a web-based tool, or Slagger in China? Do you use Word? Whatever you use, you have to be explicit about it and don't assume that everybody uses the same. But in science, mostly people are using Overleaf or LaTeX tools in general. How do you deal with references? That's also a very important point once you work in a team, right? So are you using tools like EndNote, Mendeley, Bibsonomy, etc.? So there are different tools out there where a number of people can share the management of references. That's very important, because if you provide references into your paper, you have to be unique. So don't do the work. Don't confuse the work between the different authors of the paper. Then the question of who is writing. So who are the authors, the co-authors? This is a very interesting question, because it puzzles young students in most cases. There are different traditions. I'm sure you have encountered papers where you wonder, why is in some papers always the professor at the first? Why is he always at the end? What is the ordering thing all about? Now, let me demystify this to you. There is no right or wrong. There are just simply different traditions how people do this. And I try to summarize them by giving them names. So here I have the liberalist tradition. So here the idea is the pre-doc who basically does most of the work. So he is in the first author. Then the postdoc who is supporting, possibly the pre-doc, and the professor himself or herself at the end of it, so that it can be identified and also is contributing to the paper. So basically here the idea is that the advisor stimulates the student to venture into the wild world, but covering his or her back. You basically see that literally in the author list. Covering the back is actually more important than you might think, because the professor at the end of the paper is basically giving a stamp of approval as well. It's not like he's just there because he's the professor of the group or she's the professor of the group. Because most people also identify the name of the professor and connect that with a certain approach to research, with a certain strength of research, etc. It's just a simple reality, right? So it helps the reader to more quickly parse the paper into which bucket it actually fits. So this is the liberalist tradition. The centralist tradition is that the professor's name, the advisor's name, always goes first. The idea is here the advisor is the boss, pays the bills, and everyone else should follow. I'm not judging, I'm just saying what it is. So the professor goes first, and then the pre-doc, and then the postdoc. Then there is the credit tradition. The credit tradition is that the author list is basically based on the percentage of contribution of each author. So in the credit tradition, the author who contributes most to the writing goes first. So it's like 60% you did of the work, so you go as the first author, and so on. Then there is the alphabetical tradition. That's the preferred way by people whose family name begins with A. So here the idea is that the author contributes, the student, the postdoc contributes, but it doesn't matter. At the end, there is the alphabetical tradition. Some scientific disciplines rigorously follow these alphabetical traditions. Sometimes it depends on the group as well. And then, of course, as always, there are some combinations thereof. So sometimes you see also even jokes being made up. So a very good cartoon for this is by PhD Comics, where you see basically an author list giving credit where credit is due. It goes even to the guy who brought the food to the lab or something like this, right? So this is a fun thing about this, but it actually bears some reality as well. Now, writing the actual content. So we were dancing around the actual paper itself so far, but that was kind of an important warm-up phase. So what do you do when you actually write, but you haven't found the real solution, so to speak, yet? A good starting point is to write a PhD symposium paper or a poster. That could be a good way. Or a survey paper. What is a survey paper? A survey paper is, as the name suggests, a survey, like a 360 degrees of the overall topic. It basically summarizes and puts into a perspective, into a model of an abstraction, what work has been done so far. It's not just a listing of author A did this, B did this, C did this. No, that's not a survey. A real survey in the academic paper sense is that you put things into a model. So a very simple way of thinking about it is to classify different approaches into a table by creating higher levels of abstraction, saying what these different approaches do, what they differentiate, how they treat things differently, what are the assumptions, what are the hypotheses, what is the outcome, and then organize things in a different way. In other words, create things which are of value to the reader. So the reader of a survey paper is who? Guess what? It's a student who is beginning a PhD topic and simply wants to know what is out there. So if you come into a topic, let's say you come to cloud computing, it's very hard to find your entry into that topic. So what do? You typically check out survey papers and try to identify what are the research approaches, the open problems, what has been done so far in a systematic way. So you look up survey papers. They basically survey maybe 200 papers, right? You don't start with 200 papers immediately, but this survey helps you to understand how to put and categorize these 200 papers. So that's very beneficial to the reader. That's why survey papers also, if they are written well, also receive a high number of citations. Remember, citations are the currency of science. So the more citations, the better, of course. But keep in mind, you don't want only survey papers in your CV, in your publication list, because where is your original contribution, right? That is important to keep in mind as well. So for the PhD symposium, you have to follow the instructions given by the organizer, similar to what we were doing with normal papers. Or you share the state of the art as a survey paper, as I had said before, and what I have just discussed. Then basically you need to learn and practice. So there are a couple of good books out there, Writing for Computer Science, or How to Do Systematic Reviews, in particular in this case in software engineering, or The Logic in Writing and Thinking. How do you actually do that? So I think this is a very important aspect that you should train and also experiment with it. Final part of this presentation deals with the peer reviewing process. What actually does that mean? You have heard that for sure. I try to kind of summarize it here. A peer is a colleague from a research institution, university, research center, or a corporate research agency who is reading your paper, judging your paper. So peer reviewing is the foundation in scientific quality assurance. Many people criticize it, but actually it has never been replaced. Similar to what people say about democracy, there are some flaws, but we don't have anything better yet. So peer reviewing is a process that is out there, criticized a lot, but that's how it goes to this point. Peer reviewing is the process that we follow. How does it work? So the peers are scientists, professors, maybe postdocs at universities, or experts who are reading your paper. Now you have to keep in mind that those are busy people doing the review without any payment, right? So it's people like me who are working on a Sunday where we are actually free. We should not be working on a Sunday, at least in the place I am in, right? So they are doing the reviews often under difficult circumstances and timing constraints. Remember, always keep in mind, people have a stack of papers sitting in an airplane, pre-COVID times, and reading your paper and trying to create a review statement for that. So you have to understand their motivation. They are really hardworking people cutting time to other things in their life, reading your paper. So please treat that with respect. So the types of peer reviews are single blind or double blind reviews, which also relates to the notion of conflict of interest as it is written here. So in a single blind review, the names of the reviewers are not shared with the author, but the reviewers are aware of the author's identity. So in many engineering fields, this is the case. So I, as a reviewer, I am anonymous. So of course, the author does not know who provides the reviews. In a double blind review, I, as a reviewer, I don't even know who wrote the paper. Both models try to ensure that the reviewer can give an honest and an impartial evaluation of the article. Both methods have pros and cons, as you can think about it yourself. You can have positive conflicts of interest. So for example, oh, if that paper comes from MIT, it sure must be good, right? You identify the professor in the group at the end of the paper and is from MIT. Must be good paper. That's a positive one. You see the authors are all coming from a, I don't know, unknown university rank in the rank above 10,000, 1,000, you think it's not a good paper. So you have a negative prejudice already. That's also the problem. That's why people also use double-blind reviews. So the criteria that you judge the paper are these 7 typically. Now, I want to go through them so that you get the idea, because it's important that you actually know how is your paper judged. That actually helps you to understand how to improve your paper once you see the criteria. The first one is the scope. Is the article actually appropriate for this publication? Does it fit there, or is it completely off the track? Novelty. Is the material originally distinct from previous publications? If you just confirm the same thing that has been written in thousands of papers, no need to have that paper. It's not novel. So this is a showstopper. If your paper is not novel, if it's not original, why publish? Validity. Is the study well designed and executed? Is it actually valid what you are presenting? Or is it just so-called hand waving? A lot of stuff you say and claim, but there is no proof. Data. Are the data reported, analyzed, and interpreted correctly? Is it shown in the paper itself? Are you using a clear language? Is it concise and follow a logical argument? Is your paper compliant to some ethical requirements that the journal or the conference needs to impose? So for example, if you do studies which require ethical things like in the healthcare domain with patients, etc. So do you follow those rules? And finally, the advancement. So is this a significant contribution to the field? This is a super important question you need to be able to answer for every paper that you write. And of course, if you are a reviewer, which many of you in this audience probably are as well, you should train yourself to ask yourself these questions. Now, what I can recommend is what I do also with the students, in the PhD students and postdocs in my group, is I encourage them to be involved in the reviewing process, because where is better to learn how to deal with the reviews that you receive once you try to actually write a review yourself. It's very important. It's also important that you understand that the reviews that you receive should not be taken personal, right? Keep that in mind, as difficult as it might be, because it's not about you, it's about the content of the paper. Does it fulfill these criteria? So the workflow essentially now is you write the paper. Now this whole writing the paper is a workflow in itself, right? We discussed about it. A lot of iterations you go through. You submit the paper, then the peer reviewing begins. The peer reviewing results come. Maybe you have 2, 3, or maybe more reviews coming back, depending on if it's a journal or if it's a conference. You might have minor, major revisions to do. So some more iterations, some good proposals how to improve. Maybe it's a reject, maybe it's an accept. Most of the cases, the papers are not accepted right away. Some conferences, you have a rebuttal phase, similar to a journal, where you are able to basically provide a rebuttal to the questions the reviewers provided and say, I meant it like this, etc. You provide improvements. Then you submit your camera-ready version. Then the publication gets online first, and then ultimately maybe it is published then as a printed form in the conference proceedings or in the journal. So in other words, there is a process to all of this. And now there are many different types also in conferences and journals, how they are kind of merging these workflows between conferences and workshops in journals as well. So to recap the presentation in the last hour, to write a good paper, you need to have an outstanding contribution. So it really needs to fulfill that criteria. So it needs to have a top topic, a really important, timely topic. So the contribution needs to be really well defined, well executed. So in other words, every different aspect that I was talking about needs to be excellent in order to get published. You need to select the fitting publication outlet, be it a conference or a journal. Now, one recommendation of me is you should not try to go for the let's say C or D ranked conferences or journals first. Some people might think, okay, I'm now a beginner. It's probably good to start at the bottom and then work myself up. Usually that's not a very good strategy, and only will lead you to have many papers without ensuring a good quality as well. I'm not saying that every paper that is published at the great or good conference or journal by definition has a great quality, but let's be honest, the probability is that good conferences, good journals have good papers or excellent paper quality is much higher, right? So keep that in mind. Try to stretch the envelope, go out of your comfort zone, and go to the top paper, to the top publication outlets. Consider the peer reviewing process and criteria I was elaborating here, right? Consider that the reviewer is reading your paper in a very uncomfortable situation under high time pressure. Be kind to the reader as well. See things from the other side. Try to review papers yourself so that you understand what the reader actually wants to read. Never take the results personally, because most of the cases are not personally to be taken. And then develop a learning mindset. This means that you should take the review results with empathy. Try to understand what the reviewers are saying. Most of the reviewers are actually really interested in improving the quality. There are very few people out there who just want to put you down. Please keep that in mind. Most of the scientists are really honest and good people who like to help. So keep that in mind and treat everybody with respect. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. And we have now enough for time for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Our audience can, sir, please take it.
So my question is, you were talking about before writing, we have to read, and you were mentioning the high impact conferences and journals that we should start from there. But there are a lot of research over there for a beginner student, for an undergrad student. where it should start from. Like if I want to pursue my career in the artificial intelligence and specifically in computer vision, where I should start from? What are those journals and conferences I should consider before pursuing my career?
Right. So the best way is that you make yourself familiar with the culture of a particular community. So the communities that you mentioned are very well established communities. So you know the top conferences and you know the top journals. If you don't know them, ask the supervising professor. If the supervising professor does not know, that's not a good sign as a footnote. But if should that happen, you should take the lead for yourself. Go to a site such as research.com and check out what are going into the sub-community, what are the top conferences, what are the top journals. They are all listed there. And they are listed there because of the so-called impact factor. So that factor basically shows how often a paper from that particular conference or journal is referenced again. So in other words, what is the impact? And that can help you, and that you can have a list. So it's a very clear list. It's not like magic. So you can go there and check it out. It's no problem. So you can identify the top outlets. After you have identified the top outlets, you will, after a while, identify the top authors too. So you will know exactly who are the top groups in the world who publish in this particular field. Go and read their papers, okay? Second avenue that you can take is look at survey papers. So for example, there is ACM computing surveys, right? So that journal only publishes surveys. So they are very long papers typically. And there you learn about the top papers in that particular topic. Another place to look is Proceedings of the IEEE. They also have many papers which are long with special issues on particular topics. There you can find the top papers and the top people.
So is there any pyramid that I should start building from bottom to top that will help me to go to some specific, like a pinpoint where I should start from? A paper should address a single point from all this knowledge. So is there any pyramid that I should follow, any flow chart or workflow? Like suppose how many people I have to read before writing a paper? How many papers should I read?
No, this is impossible to say, but to be very honest, I mean, it's impossible to say you need to read 200 papers before you can write something. That's not true, right? But on the other hand, there is what exists is a typical process during the PhD, for example. Initially, you think, oh, this is a super exciting topic. You go up and up. And at some point, you basically have a tipping point. And that is typically the point where you have identified most of the authors. And suddenly you realize, wow, everything has been said before. I have nothing new to offer. And that is the time when you basically kind of collapse under quotes. You think, oh my God, my life is wasted. I don't know what to contribute. I'm in deep trouble and blah, 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 right? And then it goes down. And you basically better understand what is out there, and you kind of find your niche in that community. My gut feeling is, but that completely depends on the community that you are working in, right? So you basically have to have really read most of the papers in that particular field that you are dealing with before you can really make a good contribution. You need to know what is out there in related work. Now, of course, this means that being a scientist, being a researcher, as the year is becoming harder. And it is true, yes, because if you just have 10 papers out there as related work, it's different than if you have 2,000 papers. It's obvious. But still, what I told you, the way to structure those down into computing survey papers, looking at the surveys, trying to distill what is in there, that helps a lot to understand it faster than before. Because sometimes you might be able to rule out very quickly certain approaches which are not in line with what you want to do. And basically you can carve out many papers already to read, for example. But the PhD itself, if you abstract away again, PhD basically means that you know related work better than your supervising. So you need to clarify a bit the question.
Thank you, Professor.
Research integrity. Whenever there is a discussion about research, worldwide universities have a mandatory course for research practices, professional practices in research. How would you define the importance of research integrity, and what are the significant and important aspects of research integrity, in a very simple words for the audience?
Well, research integrity covers, it's a container for many things, right? So, for example, it means many things. One is the ethical aspects, the compliance aspect, or that you don't make up data simply by inventing some data points and then creating some funny theory and graphs about it and stuff like that, right? So, of course, it's needless to say that it is super important. And basically, when you don't follow integrity, it will always bounce back to yourself, right? So you should always follow integrity rules. That's for certain. I mean, that's how much I can say, right? Usually, you know, when you do the hard work, it always pays off as well, because you have to understand that science is, you are doing that for yourself as well. It's not something that somebody can take away from you, right? So if you invest in your own knowledge, it's your knowledge. Nobody can take it, and you make progress. So don't be afraid to do the hard work, even if it's maybe sometimes tempting to not to do so. Another thing about this integrity, one thing I think I did not mention is that if you don't do double submissions. And I have seen, you have to be aware that, you know, if you submit to a journal, that journal is not alone in the universe. So I give you an example. I am editor-in-chief of Computing. This is a journal in Springer, right? Springer is a very famous publishing house. It does not only have one journal, so they have staff. What they do is they will check each paper that is incoming with all the other journals that they have. And if they see that a paper is submitted to 2, 3, 5 or more journals at the same time, doesn't matter what comes above 2, it's actually blacklisted, right? So the author is blacklisted and you ruin your name. So don't do that. So double submission is something that should be simply not done. Don't even think about it. Don't even think about it. This is just bad. So the way to do it is, you can think of different pipelines. What is a healthy thing to do is basically you think of, is my idea of this paper suitable for a conference, or is it more suitable for a journal, right? This is a good way of thinking of things, but don't submit it to both at the same time. This is very bad, right? It should be avoided. Don't do that.
Okay. Earlier career researcher, what would be the best choice? Whether he should publish his research in a conference or a journal? What would be the best choice for an early career researcher, whether he or she should submit his research in a conference or a journal?
I did not understand which researcher. AI?
For early career researcher.
Any
researcher someone who has started.
You cannot say that, because it depends. It depends on the communities. Some communities have conferences which are very important and even harder to get in than journals, and vice versa. So you cannot say that with a brush. So it depends really. But I see a clear tendency also in computer science that there is a shift towards more journal publications, and in particular more SCI ranked journals. This is what leads many people from India and Asia in general to submit papers to journals, because they have the requirement from their university for their career levels to have SCI ranked journals. And this is leads to a problem, because many papers which are actually not ready for such journals are then submitted. And that leads to a lot of frustration, because a bad paper will not get accepted in those journals.
Okay, Professor, one last question before we take a question from our audience. What is the difference between a journal impact factor and index section of a journal, and how both of these factors, research factors, determine the quality of a journal?
Well, the impact factor is basically showing how often each paper is cited again, right? So if you have an impact factor of 1, basically saying that the papers are usually, the paper is cited again 1 time. So the higher the impact factor, the better. You also have, you can look those up, those definitions, you can look those up in research.com. It's providing a very good interface for all of these things. So usually the higher the better, and that also goes with the H index of the authors and the H index of the journals or conferences. So not only people have H index, but also journals and conferences, and the higher the better, right? And that depends also, of course, what is the community. So it's very hard to compare these different numbers amongst different communities. So values are simply different. And that you can also look up when you go to Google Scholar and look at the H index of some individuals. If it's a physicist, a biologist, or a computer scientist, and even inside computer science, they have very different ranges. So they only work basically inside a particular community.
Okay, another question. How could we bring coherence and clarity into our writing if we are starting our research career?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I think the best clarity bringing thing is to think and write, always. So it's an iteration. And one good method for that is also engaging with colleagues. So what we do, for example, is inside my group, we have like a weekly seminar or whatever the rhythm is, so that the PhD student who is writing a paper for a conference, for example, has the chance to present it in front of the colleagues. And then we internally try to attack the paper. And that is actually quite helpful, because you learn many things at the same time, to defend your argument, to strengthen your argument, etc. So you need to practice. So I think the overarching idea here is to practice and go in iterations.
Thank you very much for the answers. Now we would start taking questions from our participants. Zainab Munawwir, please enable her mic. Zainab, your mic is going to be enabled. Please ask the question.
Yes, Professor, you have told us that being a new researcher, we should not go for a C or D class journals or conferences. So being a researcher, which certain journal or conference a researcher should approach? Any recommendations by you?
Yes, so I think you should address the appropriate journal or the appropriate conference. So this means that the quality of your research should match the quality of that journal or the conference. So this means that you need to basically read papers from that conference, read papers of that journal before you submit something there, okay? Now, why is that important? Because you want to make yourself familiar with the quality and the way that things are done in that particular journal or in that particular conference. Hopefully, after some time, I'm not talking about the bootstrapping process itself, but hopefully after some time, you will adjust in a better way where to submit your work to, right? In principle, I showed you the direction. You should go to the top, put yourself put the bar there where you can stretch yourself. Don't put it too low, because otherwise you will not grow. You want to grow, right? That's the idea. It's like sports. You have to create challenges in order to become better. create those challenges for yourself. Sometimes you have a professor who can work as your coach, saying that I think now you can go to the next level, right? You know, stretch, go out of your comfort zone. Sometimes you have to work alone. It depends on the context that you're in. And then you have to become your own coach. But that's important. Please take that seriously, because once you acquire that goal to understand that this is the higher level, that you discern low quality from high quality, then you can make improvements and then you can make progress in your scientific career.
All right. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Please, we are going to take the second question from Hadi. Please enable her mic.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Sir, I didn't really have any question about this because you explained very nicely. I would just like to say that I would just like to thank you for all the information, and I feel very glad that I joined the conversation. And I'm a BS student as of now, so I plan on writing a paper. I would love it if you can review my paper.
You would love if I read your paper?
Yeah, I would love it if you review my paper.
I will do my best. I will do my best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your kind remarks. And now we are going to take this question from our participant, Mayer, if I'm pronouncing it right, I think. Mr. Mayer?
Yes.
Okay, your mic is enabled, please ask.
Yes. Hi, Professor.
Hi.
Sir, my question is regarding, sir, means regarding the conference, sir. Means what the difference that which can make that A star, A and C level conference?
What is the difference?
Means the priority is always A star conference is having more priority, but
Yes.
as an earlier starter, may I go with the means C level, B or A star, or should I start with directly with high top level conference?
Well, this is the problem of bootstrapping I was mentioning before, because initially you don't, so basically your initial goal would be to read papers from the top conferences and top journals. Have you done that? If you have done that, you can judge your paper. And that, even if you misjudge, that's a good exercise, because you need to be able to understand where are your limitations. As long as you don't understand where are your own limitations, you will not make progress. So if you think you are great, but you're actually not great, you will fail always and again. And that just leads to bitterness, because you think nobody understands the quality of your work, only you can understand it. And that leads to bitterness and frustration. So the most important thing is that you first need to understand what is excellent, what is good, and what is not so good. You need to be able to differentiate those, right? It's actually similar to music as well. Regardless of genre of the music, you need to be able to understand, is that a good music? Has it quality or not, right? So how do you judge that? Well, the point is that you need to do it over again, to read those papers, to go deeper, to understand what is inside. Because usually the better the paper, the more zipped, basically, the more packed they are with information. I would say that you can judge the quality as well here. So there is nothing that is just bloating the paper. It's really concise, very precise, and things like this. But you can only learn that if you practice yourself, sit down, read paper after paper after paper, and be critical and learn something from that.
Thank you so much, sir.
We are going to take the next question from Clay Plemira, one of our participants. Your mic is enabled, please ask the question. Clay Plemira, your mic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, Professor Schahram.
Hi, how are you doing?
Glad to see you again.
I don't see you, but I'm glad to hear you.
yeah, I cannot activate my camera. Thank you first for this very enlightful presentation. Actually, my question is regarding a particular paper that goes me to a particular direction, let's say software engineering. And in the end of this paper, I realized that it goes me to another direction, to another different area, like say distributed system. So to prove my theory, I have not all the elements, because I'm not going to the distributed system, for example, and my paper will be limited. So how is the best way, in your opinion, to make this transition for one specific area to another direction? So I just let it go. That paper, it's limited because I cannot prove everything. Or I can say, okay, my paper is here, I have limitations, but I need to go to another direction to go further in that research. What's your opinion about that, please?
Yeah, thank you very much. So there are two things. One is to understand the positioning, as Clay has said. There are two things, right? One aspect is very important for every one of the people in the audience, to be able to position yourself inside the community. I did not mention that explicitly, but that is also super important. Where do you belong to? Please make that decision explicitly as early as possible. So do you go to AI, or do you go to machine learning, or do you go to cloud computing, or are you the machine learning guy in the cloud computing community, or are you the cloud computing guy in the machine learning community? You see the difference? I want to kind of make it a little bit more fine-grained for your thoughts. This is important for a career decision, okay? You have to position yourself inside a community. And this has something to do with you. Who do you want to be? Which people do you want to surround yourself with? Do you feel comfortable in that community or in that community? Very important. Think about that. It takes a while to sink in. The other thing that Clay mentioned is the question of, you discover something that you are actually sitting between two seats somehow, two chairs. I would suggest in such a case, in particular, when you are transitioning community, to understand, as you have done yourself right now, is that you are basically transitioning from one to the other community, and there it is helpful to actually step back and then consider to make a journal paper out of that work, which actually deals with that transition phase. So here you basically put the spotlight exactly on where you have to go, namely on the transition from software engineering to distributed systems. So provided and because it probably needs more work, I think that you should probably work first to do the whole thing as a journal paper and then submit it to that more appropriate journal. But these papers are better for journals than for conferences. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Schahram. Glad to see you again. I wish you a very good day. See ya.
Thank you. You too. Take care.
Thank you, Mr. Clay. The next question is from Ms. Sadif. Ms. Sadif, one of our participants, please enable her mic. Ms. Sadif, your mic is enabled. Please ask the question.
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
I would like to ask, how can we decide the idea on which we are working should be present in conference or submit in journal?
Well, so you know, the conferences usually don't have so much space for you to write, correct? So the question is, one is the space. So for example, it depends on the nature of your work. So if the nature of your work and the nature of your argument can only be expressed by having 20 different plots and graphs and showing how things develop and making the case in very fine granular data interpretation, conferences are probably difficult. So you have simply more space in journals. On the other hand, if you identify a conference which really fits, you are able to express your argument within the page limits of that conference, you can also do a conference, because conferences have the plus point that you would typically go someplace and make a presentation and you meet people, you network with people. This is, of course, something in this pandemic, which basically we were all we could not do it because online conferences do not offer the same quality, of course. But I think a healthy mix is good, especially in the beginning. If you are in the beginning phase, I would think that conferences are very helpful for you to get a feeling, because at the end, it's not just about publishing papers, it's also about your positioning in the community. You need to understand what is the community all about, who are the people dealing with this, because at the end, also, as it goes back to peer reviewing, those people who are reviewing your papers are basically the same crowd who are in the conference, right? So make yourself familiar with the program committee of that conference. Applies also to the editorial board members of the journal, of course. You need to make yourself familiar with the people.
Sir, I want to ask second question. How do you think about bibliometric analysis papers for the beginners researchers?
What do you mean? Do you mean to understand? I'm not sure, because I can interpret that question differently. What do you mean exactly?
That for the beginner researchers, either the bibliometric analysis papers give them knowledge about the institutions, authors, and different papers like this, most important journals, famous journals.
Yeah, I think bibliometrics are okay, but I think actually qualitatively survey papers are probably more useful for a beginner. So in other words, once you have the topic, try to identify survey papers, typically in computing surveys or in proceedings of the IEEE, which give a broad overview of the top 100 to 200 papers. That should be good enough for you to get started. That's better than the fine-grained bibliometric thing, because you need to first identify yourself how you operate in that overall research space. So understanding one particular bibliometric figure does not help you too much. So I would go for surveys first, understand the surveys first.
Thank you.
And then, of course, go to the individual papers, right? So when I say surveys, I don't mean that you only read the survey, but it helps you to create a taxonomy in your brain, but you should also read the papers then afterwards, the papers which are referenced in the survey. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's all from our participants. We have heard all the questions here, and thank you very much for answering these questions.
There's one question I see.
I think they have asked a question but forgot to load their hands down.
Okay. All right. Fine.
All right. Thank you very much. These questions always make our sessions very engaging and interactive. Thank you very much for answering in the detail. Now, I would like to invite Advisor GCU-ACM Student Chapter, our mentor, who always provides us incredible support to organize these sessions. Sir Mohammed Hafiz, please take over, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor. I, on the behalf of Department of Computer Science, GCU University Lahore, Pakistan, and in particular GCU-ACM Student Chapter, thank you a lot to be with us. I present my heartiest gratitude for your valuable time and sharing of your knowledge with us. We hope to have more such endeavors with you in the future to educate the community. In the end, sir, I thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to discuss with you. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. That's the end of the session. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye, sir. Thank you very much.